There's a moment, and if it's happened to you, you'll know exactly what this feels like, where you're in the middle of something that should feel good, a dinner, maybe, a trip you planned for months, your child doing something small and ordinary, and instead of being in it, you're at a slight remove, present enough to function. Somewhere else entirely, and the strange part, the part nobody talks about, is that you can't point to what took you away. There's no crisis, no emergency. Just this persistent, low-grade distance between you and your own life. This video is about what created that distance, not the obvious things. The hours, the deadlines, the pace, the invisible things. The costs that were never listed anywhere. The price that ambition charges, that nobody warned you about because most people don't find the receipt until much later. By the end of this, you'll have a name for what you've been carrying. And that name, just having it, changes something. Let's start with how the trade actually works. Here's the thing about the way ambition extracts its price. It never does it all at once. There's no moment where someone sits you down and says, "Here is what the next 10 years will cost you. Here is what you will give up. Here is what will go quiet while you're not looking." It happens in increments. A dinner you skip, a weekend that disappears into a project, a conversation where you're nodding but already somewhere else in your head. And none of those moments feel significant in isolation. That's the mechanism. Each individual trade feels reasonable, because it is reasonable in that moment. The deadline is real. The opportunity is real. The thing that has to get done genuinely has to get done. So you make the trade, and then you make it again, and again. And somewhere across all those trades, across all those individually reasonable decisions, something accumulates. Not a crisis, not a collapse, just a slow, quiet accumulation of absences. Research on what happens to people under sustained performance pressure consistently shows the same pattern. The first thing to go isn't health, isn't relationships, it's presence. The capacity to actually be inside an experience rather than managing it from a slight distance. And the reason nobody warned you is that presence doesn't show up on any metric. It doesn't appear in the performance review. It doesn't register in the bank account. It just quietly leaves while every visible indicator says you're winning. Now, if you were to look back at when this really began, not when you noticed it, but when it actually started, it probably goes back further than you think. If you were to trace the timeline honestly, not the career timeline, the other one, it would probably start earlier than you think. There was a version of you that existed before the performance, before the output became the measure. A version that had time to be bored, that could finish a meal without thinking about what came after. That felt things in real time, in the moment they were happening, rather than processing them later when there was a gap in the schedule. That version didn't disappear overnight. It happened in the small surrenders. The first time you took your laptop on vacation and told yourself it was just for 1 hour. The first time your partner said something and you responded to the surface of what they said while your mind was still on the project. The first time your child asked you to play and you said in a few minutes, and the few minutes became the evening. None of those moments felt like loss when they were happening. That's important to understand. They felt like the cost of being responsible, of showing up, of providing, of being the person other people could count on. And in a way, they were. The real cruelty of this isn't that you made the wrong choices. It's that so many of those choices were genuinely necessary. The mortgage was real. The team was real. The obligations were real. The system you were operating inside had very little room for anything that didn't produce a visible return. So the things that couldn't be measured, the quality of your attention, the depth of your presence, the aliveness that used to arrive when you weren't monitoring it, those things got crowded out, not because you didn't value them, because the system had no column for them. And across months and years of that, something that should feel very much like loss starts to accumulate, even if you've never let yourself call it that. Which brings us to what it actually is. There's a word for what this is, and it's probably not the word you've been using, if you've been using any word at all. It's grief. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind with a clear object and a clear cause. This is the quieter kind. The grief that accumulates when something is lost so gradually that there was never a moment to mourn it. The grief of the presence you used to have that went somewhere you didn't notice. The grief of the relationship that got what was left over after the work took what it needed. The grief of the version of yourself that existed before performing your worth became the organizing principle of your days. Psychology has a name for what happens when grief goes unacknowledged. When the loss is real, but the language isn't there to name it. It doesn't dissolve. It goes underground. It shows up as a flatness, a distance, a persistent low-grade sense that something is missing that you can never quite locate. That specific flatness, that sense of watching your life from slightly behind glass, that's not a character flaw. That's not ingratitude for what you built. That's unacknowledged grief doing exactly what unacknowledged grief does. And the reason nobody warned you about this is that grief requires someone willing to sit with it. Most of the productivity space, the hustle culture, the performance optimization content, the slow living aesthetic that's really just slower hustle, none of it will sit with you in this, because sitting with it doesn't produce anything. And in a system that measures everything by output, sitting with grief has no return on investment. So the warning never came. And the grief accumulated without a container. And somewhere across the years of that, you ended up in that moment at the dinner table, or in the car before walking into your own home, present enough to function. Somewhere else entirely. This is grief. Not failure, not weakness, not ingratitude for what you built or who you've become. Grief. And you are allowed to call it that. If something in this section just clarified, if naming it as grief shifted something, even slightly, there's a resource in the description built for exactly this step. It's called the Real Cost Inventory. It's a guided workbook that takes about 20 minutes and walks through the specific accounting. This video opened the door to what was actually given, what was quietly set aside, what has a name now, not another thing to do, a structure for the naming that just began. Link is in the description. So the question that's probably coming up now is, what do you actually do with this? Here's the objection that's probably surfacing right now, because it's the one that almost always does at this point. I chose this. I worked hard because I wanted to. I made the decisions I made. How can I grieve something I chose? And the answer to that is something that the productivity space will almost never say out loud. Choosing something and grieving its cost are not a contradiction. They are what honest accounting looks like. You can have wanted the career and still grieve the presence it cost you. You can be proud of what you built and still mourn the version of yourself that got quieter while you were building it. You can love the people in your life and grieve the quality of attention they received when you were running on empty and didn't know it. None of those are contradictions. They're the full picture, and the full picture is the only one that leads anywhere worth going. Because here's what naming the loss actually does. It's not the same as losing more. It's not dismantling what you built. It's not a requirement to blow anything up or walk away from anything, or begin some transformation that requires circumstances you don't currently have. Naming the loss is simply the first honest step, the prerequisite to everything that comes after. It's the difference between managing your life from a distance and beginning to live inside it. The distance doesn't close overnight. Nothing here suggests it does. But the distance cannot close at all, as long as what created it goes unnamed. You've been carrying something without language for a long time. And something without language cannot be set down, it can only be carried. What this video gave you is the beginning of the language. Not the full vocabulary, not the complete map. Just the first accurate word for the specific weight you've been moving through the world with. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, where it starts. If you want to take that further, the Real Cost Inventory in the description gives you the structure to do the actual accounting. 20 minutes, no performance required. Link in the description and in the pinned comment. There's usually one moment, one specific, ordinary moment, where the invisible cost briefly surfaced before getting buried again. What was yours? So here's where this lands. The ambition was real. The work was real. The obligations that made every trade feel reasonable. Those were real too. None of what you built is being discredited here. None of what you sacrificed is being called a mistake. What's being named, finally with precision, is that the sacrifice was real. That things were given up that had genuine value. That presence, aliveness, the version of you that existed before the performance became the measure. Those things were worth something. And their loss is worth acknowledging. There's a question that doesn't need to be answered today, maybe just carried. Who were you before you learned to measure yourself? Not before the career, not before the obligations, before the performance. Before you understood that your presence in a room was supposed to be justified by what you contributed to it, that version of you was there. They went quiet somewhere along the timeline. But quiet isn't gone. The grief you're allowing yourself to name today, that specific, low-grade, unexamined weight, that is not evidence that you built the wrong life. It's evidence that the person who was supposed to be living it has been waiting to be acknowledged. You've already paid for this knowledge. The years were real, the trades were real, the cost was real. What you do with it, that part is still open, and that part is yours.